Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. This time, we're hitting the gas on a story that has huge implications for, well, anyone who drives a car or wants to drive a car in the future.
It's a big one, and honestly pretty complex, which is why we're here to break it down.
Exactly. We're talking about emissions regulations, car production, and maybe even a future where finding that perfect car is, well, a little harder. And to help us make sense of all this, we've got our expert riding shotgun. Always great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Always love a good car chat.
All right, so big news dropping recently. Stellantis, they're the company behind brands like Jeep, Ram, those big names. Well, they might be hitting the brakes on some of their gas-powered car production. And get this, they might do it as early as next month.
Yeah, it's a bold move, and I think it really underscores the pressure car makers are feeling from those increasingly stringent emissions targets.
Okay, so back up for a second, because I think some people listening might be thinking, wait, why would a company just, choose to make fewer cars? Doesn't that mean less money for them?
It definitely seems counterintuitive on the surface, right? But it all comes down to those EU emissions regulations and the hefty fines associated with missing those targets.
Okay, so fines. Got it. But we're talking about giant companies here, right? Like, how bad can these fines really be?
Oh, they can be eye-watering. Imagine a 95 fine, that's euros, for every single gram of CO2 a car emits over the limit, and not just per model, per car. Now multiply that by the millions of cars a company like Stellantis produces, and you're talking potential fines in the billions. Suddenly making a few less cars doesn't sound so bad.
Wow, okay, billions with a B. Yeah, that puts things in perspective. So what are these targets exactly? What's the magic number that has car makers so spooked?
So right now, the EU mandates a fleet average of 115.1 grams of CO2 per kilometer driven. That's the average across all the cars they sell. But buckle up, because that target drops to 93.6 grams per kilometer in 2025, and then takes a nosedive to a seemingly impossible 49.5 grams per kilometer by 2030.
Whoa, 2030? That's what, like 6 years away? It's like they're trying to invent a whole new way to get around in the time it takes most people to pay off their car loan. So Stellantis is looking at these deadlines, these fines, and thinking, hey, maybe we should pump the brakes a little on the gas guzzlers.
It's certainly looking that way. They're basically doing a risk assessment and figuring out the least painful path forward. It's possible they make less money per car, sure, but it's still better than getting slammed with those massive fines.
So is this a sign of things to come from other car makers? I mean, Stellantis is huge, but they're not the only ones navigating this new world.
Right. And that's the million-dollar question. If a company with the resources and scale of Stellantis is feeling the heat, you have to wonder what this means for the smaller players in the industry, the ones with even tighter margins. This could be a major turning point in how cars are made and sold, not just in Europe, but globally.
It's almost like they're saying, look, we'll make the change, but we need a bit more time to get the kinks worked out.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, even if car companies wanted to switch to all-electric production overnight, could they? I mean, are people even buying EVs fast enough to make up for the potential drop in gas-powered cars?
That's the other part of this whole equation, right? Consumer demand. Electric vehicles are definitely having a moment, but are they mainstream yet?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And the data tells an interesting story. In the first half of 2024, you know how many car makers were actually below that 2025 emissions target?
How many?
Two. Just two. Tesla and Geely. Everyone else had work to do.
Wow, only two. So much for a mass takeover. But hey, at least EV sales are still going up, right?
Well, actually, not quite. Get this. Overall, EV sales in Europe actually dipped compared to last year. So we've got stricter regulations coming, car makers potentially pumping the brakes on production, and EV adoption that's not quite keeping pace. It's like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah, I get that analogy. It's a lot to balance, and it's happening in a market where consumers, us regular folks, still have a lot of questions about EVs. Like the range anxiety thing, that's still a big one, right?
Huge. People are worried about getting stranded with a dead battery, especially if they're used to just pulling up to a gas station.
And then there's the whole charging infrastructure issue. It's one thing to plug in at home, but what if you're on a road trip? Are there enough charging stations out there?
Totally. And not all chargers are created equal either, right? Some are super fast, some take hours. It can get complicated.
And let's not forget the price tag. EVs still tend to be pricier up front than their gas-powered counterparts. So I get why some people are hesitant to make the switch, even with those long-term fuel savings. It's a big investment.
Absolutely. And that's something policymakers really need to consider as they push for this electric future. How do we make EVs accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford the latest and greatest tech?
Okay, so we've got some challenges on the EV front. But zooming out a bit, this whole thing, these EU regulations, they're not happening in a vacuum, right?
Hmm.
Is this just a European thing, or are we seeing this push for electrification elsewhere?
It's definitely a global trend, which is actually pretty exciting. We're seeing similar regulations popping up all over the place. Take California, for example. They've also mandated that all new car sales must be zero emission by 2035.
Wow, 2035 seems to be the magic year, huh?
It's ambitious, but it also shows a real commitment to tackling climate change. And it's not just governments either. A lot of major car manufacturers are setting their own targets for phasing out gas-powered vehicles.
So we've got regulations pushing from one side and companies innovating from the other. Sounds like we're headed for a pretty major shift in the automotive industry. But what does it actually mean for, well, for me, for the average person? Like, what should I expect if I'm thinking about buying a new car in the next few years?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, there's no crystal ball here. But here's what I'm thinking. If fewer gas-powered cars are being made and EVs aren't filling that gap fast enough, we've got to consider what happens to supply and demand.
Right. Could this lead to a surge in used car prices as gas-powered cars become a hotter commodity, like a collector's item almost?
It's possible. And then what about people who can't afford a brand new EV? Could this actually widen the gap between those who can afford to go electric and those who are stuck with fewer options in their price range?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
This isn't just about fancy new cars. It's about access to reliable transportation, which impacts everything from jobs to healthcare to, well, just getting around.
Exactly. And it highlights something really important about this whole transition to a greener economy. It can't just be about new technology. It has to be about equity and making sure everyone benefits from these changes, not just a select few.
Okay, so lots to unpack there on the consumer side of things. But zooming out even further, what does this shift mean for the car market as a whole? Will we see a wave of new players emerging with innovative EV solutions, or will the established giants maintain their grip on the steering wheel?
It's going to be a fascinating race to watch. We're already seeing a surge in startups and tech companies jumping into the EV market.
It's like the Wild West out there, but instead of saloons, we've got charging stations.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, they're not just focused on building cars, they're thinking about the whole ecosystem.
The ecosystem. Okay, what do you mean by that?
So think about it. We're not just talking about new cars, right? We're talking about new ways to use those cars. Ride sharing, for example, that could become even more popular with EVs.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah, because range anxiety is less of a factor if you're just using an EV for, like, short trips around town.
Exactly. And then there's the whole self-driving thing. That technology is advancing so quickly, and it's really intertwined with the shift to EVs.
Okay, so self-driving electric cars zipping us around while we, what, like, read a book in the back seat?
Maybe. Or work, or even like take a nap. The possibilities are pretty mind-blowing when you start thinking about it.
Okay, so we've gone from potentially fewer gas-powered cars to self-driving electric utopias. It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It really is, and I think that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating. We're not just talking about tweaking a few things. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how we think about transportation, about our relationship with cars.
So for those of us who aren't quite ready to give up our steering wheels just yet, what's the key takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that change is coming, and it's coming fast. The car you drive today might not look anything like the car you drive 10 years from now.
So should we all be running out to buy EVs right now?
I wouldn't say run, but it's definitely something to start thinking about seriously. Do your research, weigh the pros and cons, and most importantly, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Solid advice. Because it sounds like this is just the beginning of a very long and very interesting ride. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Always a pleasure to chat cars with you.
Anytime. Always happy to geek out about the future of mobility.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, keep those engines running and those minds open.